All right, well, this lesson is perhaps one of the most important lessons and the most challenging, and it's one that's often neglected by studies on apologetics, and that is in particular the way that we defend the faith. Okay, now I'm no stranger to seeing many Christians who study apologetics and understand arguments and theology and opposing positions very well, but yet the manner in which they engage their opponents is hardly anything at all close to the way in which the Bible commands us to engage with unbelievers. And I'm also no stranger to seeing Christians use really horrible arguments in apologetic situations or in evangelistic situations, arguments that are so horrible that they themselves would not even be convinced by. And with social media, Christians have access to debates and unbelievers more often than ever before. So the question before us is basically, how should Christians engage in apologetics? How should Christians argue for the faith? In short, we should do so as Christians. That means that there are principles that should govern and guide how we speak about and how we present the truth. So the following study is going to be a brief introduction to the tools that Christian apologists have on hand. So this is kind of like our little toolbox. So how do we use the Bible? How do we use all this knowledge, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of God, etc.? How do we use all that? How do we put it into practice? So on top of knowing your Bible, knowing theology, and many other things, the apologist must be familiar with the skills of knowing how to both formulate and how to evaluate arguments, because your opponent is going to talk back and respond back, and they're going to either give an argument of their own for whatever thing, either that they're not convinced that there's not enough evidence for God or something of that manner, and you're going to respond back to them. So you're going to need to know how to give them an argument and how to critique their arguments as well, because you're in dialogue with them. But likewise, the Christian apologist should also develop their skills in rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art or discipline that deals with the use of discourse, either spoken or written, to inform or persuade or motivate an audience. That could be an audience of one, okay? So it doesn't just have to be a big crowd or anything like that. So in a sense, any time, in any way that you speak, you're using rhetorical skills, either poorly or satisfactorily. Okay, so what follows is going to be a very brief introduction to logic, along with an introduction to persuasion. The study will conclude with the biblical basis for the manner of defense and confrontation. One apologist, the one that I've been really basing all these studies off of, Cornelius Van Til, he had a saying. He said that the apologist should be suaviter, let me see if I can pronounce this right, suaviter in modo, fortiter in re. I believe that was Dutch or Latin, I think Latin, which means something basically like to be gentle in manner of presentation, but to be powerful in substance. So this final study is basically going to be an attempt to honor that method of apologetic approach, to be gentle in manner of presentation, but powerful and basically unyielding in your approach, in your apologetic, in your stance, and the things that we presuppose in our Christianity and about the Christian faith. So let's begin looking at logic, okay, and let's begin with some definitions. So first, what is logic? Logic may be defined as the organized body, and this is from a logic textbook, okay, the organized body of knowledge or science that evaluates arguments. Okay, that's a pretty fancy definition. For me personally, I guess from a more theological perspective, I like to say that logic is basically just a tool for discerning truth. Okay, it's just a tool for discerning truth. Christians begin defining truth with God, and so Christians believe that truth is coherent, that is, that all of its parts fit together, and that it is not contradictory. A contradiction, I didn't put this in the list of definitions that you have there, but a contradiction is claiming that something is and is not in the same way and in the same sense at the same time. So that's not to be confused with a paradox, okay, which is an apparent contradiction, but that can be resolved. For instance, in the Bible, one of the bigger paradoxes that even divides Christians today is the paradox between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Most churches, I guess, split picking either or. okay, and saying that you can't, well, if you have divine sovereignty, you can't have human responsibility. Well, if you have so much human responsibility, you can't have divine sovereignty, and they kind of just break up that way, okay? That's a paradox. It's not a contradiction, okay? A statement that contains an opposite truth, for instance, okay, a contradictory statement could be something like this: Jesus is God and not God. That is a contradictory statement. But the statement Jesus is God and man is not a contradiction. Okay, so all logic is built on what is known as the law of non-contradiction, and I put it up here in symbolic logic. I haven't taken the logic course since 2002, but that's some of the stuff that I remember from symbolic logic. Okay, but the law of contradiction basically states, right, that A, okay, or something cannot be non-A at the same time and in the same sense at the same time. The nature of logic is grounded in the being and character of God. So this is not some rule, at least in Christian thinking. This is not some rule that just magically appears in the universe. That there's some I don't know, some mystical mind out there that just came up with this. This is not a human construction. We say that this comes basically from the mind of God, that it tells us something about God too, that God is coherent, that there is no contradiction in God, that God is not both righteous and evil at the same time. If he's righteous, that means he cannot be evil, etc. So we find this rooted and grounded in the being and the nature and the character of God. Now, logic evaluates arguments. Okay, so what is an argument? An argument is a group of statements, usually called premises, that lead to a conclusion. Okay, a group of statements that lead to a conclusion. So in doing apologetics, most people think of they think of arguments as these shouting matches or these events where tempers are flaring and emotions run high, but that's not what is meant by the term argument. Okay, the things that we would not include as arguments, however, would include advice. Giving advice is not an argument. Okay, merely stating what you believe is not an argument. Okay. Opinions are not arguments. Reports, illustrations, explanations, or conditional statements by themselves, that is an if-then statement, is not an argument. Okay, so a statement by itself is not an argument. It has to be a group of statements that lead to a conclusion. All right, now what is a statement? Okay, a statement is a sentence that can be judged as either true or false. A statement is a sentence that can be judged as either true or false. So for the Christian, the Word of God is the sole infallible source of what is true and what is false. So this is not to exclude other sources. And since we believe that that God's natural revelation informs us about the world, and we can study the world in the sense that what science is. Science is, in one sense, at least from a Christian perspective, it's God revealing how He created things, okay, and how He makes them work, how He governs His world. All right, but the Christian begins with the Word of God as the source of truth and the standard for recognizing falsehood. It's the measuring line. Anything that doesn't measure up to the Word of God, we would say is false. Okay. Now, the premises function as the evidence, okay, or reasons that support the conclusion. Okay, so your premises are usually reasons. Okay, they're the evidence. All right, and they support the conclusion, which is the statement that is claimed to necessarily follow from the premise. All right, the conclusion is the statement that is claimed to necessarily follow from the premise. Premise indicators. How do you know if you're looking or hearing a premise or reading a premise? Well, a premise indicator, there are words like the word since. Okay, some biblical examples. Okay, 2 Corinthians 4:13 through 16, it says, since we have the same Spirit, and there's actually a small argument in here. It says, since we have the same Spirit, for it is all for your sake. I'm just kind of jumping on here. But then it says, so we do not lose heart. There's a small argument in there that Paul is making about why the Corinthians shouldn't lose heart, because they have the same Spirit, and everything that the apostles are going through is for them. Therefore, Paul's concluding, he says, so we do not lose heart. Another premise indicator could be the phrase, as indicated by. Okay, here's a common one, because. Okay, so here's the 2 Thessalonians 1:3. It says, "We ought always to give thanks to God for you, brothers, as is right, because your faith is growing abundantly, and the love of every one of you for one another is increasing." So Paul has just made a small argument of why, in a sense, he ought always to give thanks to God for the Thessalonians. And his reasons is because their faith is growing abundantly, and the love of every one of them is increasing for another. Other common premise indicators, the word "for," the phrase "in that," "in as much as," "given that," and "seeing that." So here's Colossians 3:9. It says, "Do not lie to one another." That would be the conclusion starting from it right away. Well, why? It says, "Seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge." So there are two reasons why we shouldn't lie to each other, because we put off the old self and we put on the new self. Therefore, do not lie, or do not do the things of the old self. There's another argument from Scripture itself. Okay. Conclusion indicators include words like "therefore." All right, that's probably the most common one. Okay, Genesis 2:24. After listing, after Adam breaks out in poetry because he finally knows himself after seeing Eve, and he says, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife." So in a sense, marriage is the result. It's the height. It's the conclusion of a series of premises, as you can kind of see there in Scripture. What else? We have "therefore," "wherefore," right? And it's, "thus," "consequently." Here's a real good one. Hebrews 7:25. After talking about the priesthood of Jesus Christ, the author of Hebrews concludes. He says, "Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for the saints." So there, the author of Hebrews reasoning his way why Christ is better than the old priesthood system, because we have an eternal priest who never sleeps, who never dies, who never goes away. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost. That is, he can save more than the priests of the Old Testament. What else? As a result of, for this reason, so, or it must be that, etc., etc. Pastor and theologian John Piper, he's noted for saying that when you read the Bible, so once you're kind of familiar and aware of these things, John Piper says that when you read the Bible, you want to read it in such a way so that when you see "therefore," you want to know what it is there for. And basically he's just saying, pay attention to, in a sense, the gospel logic that's in the Bible. Pay attention to the causal inferences. I think a person can make an argument that the epistles in the New Testament are themselves arguments. They give reasons, in a sense, of what we are in Christ, and then at some point, usually midway through all these letters, you can see it especially in Colossians chapter 1 and 2, talk about Christ, his supremacy, and what he's done for us in chapter 2, and then chapter 3 all of a sudden begins, "Therefore, put off the old and put on the new." And so the epistles, the whole letter itself, is one long, drawn-out argument of basically why we should live the Christian life and how we should be living. Perhaps the locus classicus of demonstrating what is called a deductive argument. I've got it up here. This one's definitely classic. "All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal." That one's pretty common in just about every logic textbook. Something to note is that logic is especially concerned with the structure of arguments. That is to say, logic is concerned with the necessity of the argument leading to its necessary conclusion. So in a sense, you don't want to have an argument that's, "Well, I hope that's right," and you just take a shot in the dark. When, logic is concerned with constructing an argument in such a way that whenever you get the ball rolling, that it will necessarily get to its intended place, so that the conclusion will necessarily follow from the premises, that it cannot be otherwise. So logic can sometimes be reduced to symbols. In fact, math, okay? Math is basically logic, okay? Math is basically logic. I don't know how else to put it, but geometry, all that kind of stuff like that, it's basically exercises in logic. Okay. For instance, the argument that I just mentioned here is referred to as a syllogism. Okay, a syllogism is an argument with two premises. Okay, now you can have arguments. I've seen arguments with like 13 premises, when you get those really advanced philosophical papers and stuff like that. But a syllogism is an argument with two premises, usually a major and a minor premise, leading to a conclusion. So I've got that right up here. Major premise, minor premise, and then drawing a conclusion. So the above argument also may look familiar from math class, right? If A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. So there is a very classic syllogism. I forget the name of it. There's a technical name for that kind of syllogism. But in a sense, you can see the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. It cannot be otherwise. It necessarily follows. Okay. Now, because deductive logic, that's what we're doing here, okay, is concerned with the structure primarily. Okay, so it's not necessarily concerned with the content, immediately. Okay, but because it's concerned with the structure, the conclusions in an argument could be evaluated as what are called sound, okay, or cogent, and yet valid and or false, or invalid or false. Okay, for instance, I could have argued. Okay, in a sense, almost basically using the exact same structure. I could have argued all males are human. A dog can be male, therefore a dog can be a human. Okay, I used the exact same structure. All I did was plug in different terms. Okay, now what happened is I have two true premises, because it is true that all males, okay, or actually it's not true that all males are human, but let's just, at least I should say men, right? All men are human, right? Okay? A dog can be a male, therefore a dog can be human. Okay? Those are true premises, but the conclusion that a dog can be human is definitely false. Okay? Now that's challengeable in this postmodern age, right? And with all that's going on, if you haven't seen the memes on Bruce Jenner, they're putting memes on Facebook now. They have a picture of a dog, and it says, "This is Bruce Jenner's cat," and it's really hilarious, really pathetic. But anyway, based on the structure of the argument, okay, the conclusion necessarily follows. So the argument would be what we call sound, okay, but it's not valid. That is, it doesn't yield a true conclusion. Okay, an invalid argument is an argument in which the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the given premises. Okay, an invalid argument is an argument in which the conclusion does not necessarily follow given the premises. All right, so in this argument, the conclusion is clearly false. Okay, so this argument is sound, but it's invalid. All right, so in a sense, there's an example of deductive logic. All right, now another form of arguments are called inductive arguments. Okay. Inductive arguments are arguments that claim the conclusion is probably true. So these are based on probability. Okay, that it's probably true given the truthfulness or the strength of the premises. Okay, so these arguments could be arguments that lead to a prediction. Okay, for instance, here's one, right? The sun rose yesterday. The sun rose today. Therefore, it stands to reason that the sun will come up tomorrow, right? I don't know, what's that, Annie? Right? Okay. Yeah. That is a prediction. That is an inductive argument. Okay. What else? Arguments from analogy. Okay. For instance, okay, my Dell computer is awesome. Therefore, everyone's Dell computer must be awesome. Okay, just kind of reasoning from analogy. Based on mine, everybody else's must be the same. Must be analogous. Okay. That can be probably true and probably not. So that's called an inductive argument. What else? A generalization. Right? Here's where we get, racism and things like that, right? Juan is lazy, therefore all Mexicans are lazy. That is an inductive argument. Okay? But you can kind of see where stuff gets started from. What else? Causal inferences, right? Here, these are superstitions. A black cat crossed my path, therefore I had bad luck all week. That's there's a fancy term for that. It's called an post hoc ergo propter hoc. Okay? It means after this, therefore, because of this, where we basically make causal inferences, oh, well, I fell down the steps. Oh, well, what happened to you before? I broke my mirror. It was the mirror breaking that caused you to fall down the steps. And I say, oh, my goodness. That's what those are the kind of things that superstitions are made of. Okay. Now, there are fancy names for, for all of those and many other forms of arguments. Okay. Without going into too much detail about arguments, all that is well beyond the bounds of one lesson. We should at least be aware that when formulating arguments, we must be sure that they are logical. Okay, so sometimes, you do have to spend time thinking about how you would argue against, whatever position. The arguments for the, for the existence of God. Those things didn't just kind of pop up one day. They took time. They had to be thought about, kind of brewed in the mind, making sure that everything is stated clearly and coherently. Here's something to mark. Incoherence is the mark of a failed argument. Incoherence is the mark of a failed argument. Basically, if you have to resort to kind of dirty arguments, you pretty much have nothing to stand on. Okay, so there's just a few tips to making and presenting arguments, whether written or oral. You have them listed there. Tip number 1, distinguish your premises and conclusions. Okay, and make sure that, when you mark those out, that in a sense, here's where you use your premise indicators and your conclusion indicators. You know what it is that you're trying to prove and how you're going to get there. In a sense, with an argument, with a conversation especially, make sure you have a plan of approach. Especially doing apologetics, it's very easy to get caught in, I didn't list this fallacy, but what is called a red herring or a rabbit trail. People just take you off and, all types of stuff. You want to talk to them about their sin and, hey, what do you think about the Caitlyn Jenner thing? And there you go. And, all of a sudden, you're not on the trail of their sin anymore. You're off on some other rabbit trail, as they call it. Okay, so make sure you distinguish your premises and your conclusions. Have a plan, formulate it, run through it. Okay. Number 2, present your ideas in a natural order. Okay, so this can take place differently in different situations. If you're in, let's say, like a formal debate, your conclusion is going to be stated pretty much at the beginning of the debate, usually in the debate thesis. Is God evil? Or they might, if you're in the atheist territory, and they take the affirmative, maybe they'll have the thesis of the debate as something like the New Testament God is evil. Okay, and so the conclusion is already stated, and you're either going to be affirming or denying and basically giving reasons for. So you can start with a conclusion first, or you can start with your premises and just kind of walk them through and get them to the conclusion. You see that a lot in the Bible. You see that a lot in the Bible. The author of Hebrews, in a lot of places, he talks about the priests. Well, they weren't too good, but Jesus, and he compares how Jesus is better. And then they're like we saw in Hebrews 7:25, consequently, Jesus is able to save to the uttermost. Okay, so present your ideas in a natural order. All right. Number 3, start from reliable premises. All right, don't make stuff up. Some people, if you don't know your Bible well enough, or things like that, if you don't know it, don't use it. I just put it that way. If you're going to use outside sources and things of that nature, which a lot of times is recommended when you're talking to people who aren't very familiar with the Bible, kind of like Paul in Acts 17, he was willing to quote from other sources, but to demonstrate how it's God that makes those, that would make those statements true, and not the gods of the philosophers. So start from reliable premises. If you have weak or challengeable premises, okay? So for instance, if you're, well, nobody is happy, that's too general. Something like that is too general. The universal statements, all blank are blank, You don't know that unless you've seen every single, whatever it is that you're talking about. Okay, so if you start from weak or challengeable premises, you're going to have a weak and challengeable conclusion, which is not going to be very conducive to argumentation, or at least especially to persuasion. Number 4, be concrete and concise. Okay, be clear, basically. Avoid abstract, vague, or general terms. Be succinct. Okay, you don't have to be super wordy or anything of that nature. Just be clear. Lay it out straight. Be as simple as possible. Number 5, avoid loaded language. Okay, and this especially be careful not to mock or distort your opponent's position. As Christians, we should not have to appeal to false witness. Okay, that's a sin. Last time I read the 10 Commandments, in order to make our arguments appear stronger. I mean, even when I discuss, different doctrinal positions with Christians, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, to see Christians basically refer to their own position as, let's say, the only consistent Christian position or something of that nature, or the only biblical position, to simply boost their arguments. Number 6, use consistent terms. Theology and philosophy basically has its own lingo and its own language. That's why they even make philosophical dictionaries and theological dictionaries, because they just have their own lingo. They have their own way of speaking. So make sure that you define your terms and that you use the words consistently. Okay, and we have to do this because some words have multiple meanings in different contexts. For instance, when you say God to a Mormon, they do not think Trinity. When you say God to a philosopher, they do not think Trinity either. So in a sense, everybody's using the same word, God, but they have different meanings behind it. The same would go for the word Jesus. In a sense, when you say Jesus to a Mormon, they don't believe Jesus is the eternal Son of God. They believe Jesus is an offspring of God who was created. So make sure you use terms clearly. All right. Avoid the fallacy of equivocation. I didn't talk about that when I talk about fallacies in just a bit, but using same words that have two different meanings. For instance, bank. We know bank is a monetary institution, but there's also a bank that's a sloping land that's usually near a body of water, like the river bank or something of that way. Same word, but different meanings that are behind it. All right. Mm-hmm. All right, so avoiding and recognizing logical fallacies. All right, logic is a very, very, very useful tool. It's a great tool for dialogue, for apologetics, a great tool for everyday life. You should recognize that advertising is built on a particular form of argument, the ad populum. Okay, what is it? Basically, the everybody's doing it, or the bandwagon thing. Why don't you do it too? They appeal to people having a good time, and hey, want to have a good time like these people, like everybody else is. And they have you buy their product basically, but we should recognize that is logic being applied back to us. That is an argument that the advertising industry is completely built on. Okay, now arguments can be used in such a way, in a sense, as you can see, to deceive and to manipulate if the other person does not recognize fallacious arguments. A fallacy is some defect in the argument that consists in something other than merely false premises. Okay, basically something in the argument isn't connected right. Okay, something, the conclusion, it doesn't seem to follow. Something's messed up somewhere. Something's broken. Okay, there are two types of fallacies. There are what they call formal fallacies. These are like big umbrella terms. Okay, which are fallacies that deal with the form or the structure of the argument. Okay, formal fallacies, just form. Okay. Are fallacies that deal with the form or the structure of the argument. There are also what are called informal fallacies, which deal with the content of the argument. Okay, these are the ones that we're going to spend a little bit more time on here. Okay, so now one of the categories of these fallacies are called fallacies of relevance. Okay, fallacies of relevance. Okay, we cannot survey all of these, but fallacies of relevance are defects in arguments that are based on premises that are irrelevant to the conclusion. So sometimes, well, never mind, but the name itself, fallacies of relevance, because they have somehow no relevance to the argument itself. Okay, for instance, one fallacy of relevance is called the ad baculum, which basically it translates as the appeal to force. Okay, so the ad baculum, the appeal to force. This is what it might sound like. Okay, you should bake a cake for my homosexual wedding. If you don't, I'll call the Better Business Bureau and sue you for discrimination. Okay, basically, it's when you try to strong-arm somebody in an argument. Okay, that is the appeal to force. We should recognize that. That is not an argument. It's basically when you've given up arguing and you've decided it's time for power. Okay, but that is the fallacy. Okay, it occurs whenever an arguer poses a conclusion to another person and tells that person either implicitly or explicitly that some harm will come to him or her if he or she does not accept the conclusion. Give me all your money or else. Okay? There's a conclusion, give me your money, and where's the force? Or else. And of course the implied thing is or else. I'll kill you, I'll shoot you, depending on whatever it is that they have in front of you, right? Yeah, that can go in many ways. Okay, arguments against Christians by their persecutors in the beginning of the church. In a sense, this was the form of argument that they took, right? You know, you either bow down and worship Caesar, you either light the incense, or else you're going to be tortured. And that was the way that the Christians were tried to, that they were strong-armed in a sense into submission, into emperor worship. Another more common form of argumentation that you might find here, or that you might find, I guess, going on a bit more, at least it's been my experience, is called the ad hominem. Okay? The ad hominem, which means against the person, or more literally translated, it means to the man. Okay? So the idea basically is to direct the focus away from the offered argument and to direct the focus to the person, okay? To the person doing the argument. Okay, so for instance, okay, here is an example of an ad hominem argument. Well, you know those Christians are just homophobes and bigots. Therefore, we shouldn't really listen to anything at all that they have to say about human flourishing or our own happiness. There is not even an attempt to deal with the issue of morality, an attempt to deal with the issue of design or of creation. The Christian arguments are based upon there. Instead, there's just, well, let's just attack them. Let's attack their character. They don't even deal with the argument, and a lot of times it's because there is no response to the argument. So, well, what else can we do? Well, let's attack them. A lot of times this is interesting because a lot of times what is a fallacy here, though, in a court of law, the ad hominem is actually honored. When you attack the credibility of a witness, oh, well, you can't trust that person. That person's blind. Look at his eyesight. They didn't have their glasses on. Okay, they refute the testimony by basically attacking the person or the character of the person. Oh, that guy's a habitual liar. His testimony can't be upheld in this court of law. Boom. There's an ad hominem, but that ad hominem would be recognized, in a sense, not so much as a fallacy, but being upheld as valid. Okay, these arguments are very common in political campaigns. Don't vote for that guy. He smoked pot when he was young. It's kind of like, well, maybe he has a better plan than me in regards to foreign policy. What am I going to do to make up ground? Hey, he smoked pot. And there, not even an attempt to deal with the issue at hand. If you see the upcoming debates, and things like that will start happening, soon here with campaigns coming up and everybody running for president now. It was Donald Trump just jumped in. It was an interesting move, But if you pay attention to, they have their townhouse meetings when they're interacting and asking questions. Politicians are known for taking these these relevant fallacies. Basically they curtail the issue, or they'll say, hey, well, at least I'm not as bad as my opponent, and there comes the ad hominem. Okay, another infamous fallacy of relevance is the straw man fallacy. All right, this one is one of my favorites. This fallacy is committed when an arguer distorts their opponent's argument. Okay, so step one, right? Distort the opponent's argument to attack it more easily, and then two, you demolish the distorted argument. And then three, conclude that the opponent's real argument has been demolished. So kind of like the name says, basically you construct a straw man, okay? You construct a scarecrow. Instead of attacking the person, you attack the scarecrow, you destroy the scarecrow, and then walk away saying, yeah, I showed that guy. And of course the guy is still standing there. You didn't really, in a sense, you didn't even engage the opponent. You engaged, in a sense, your distorted image, basically the toned down version, so that you could easily defeat the position. In my personal experience, this happens quite a bit more with religious believers. I guess for whatever reason, when I'm arguing with other Christians, sometimes with unbelievers, but like with unbelievers, for instance, I might be arguing with a modalist. I might be discussing the doctrine of the Trinity. And, I'll lay out the doctrine of the Trinity. I'll go through all the premises and, try to be very clear. Like, I'm not arguing for three gods. I'm arguing for three persons in one being or one substance that is God. And the response back would be, so you're saying that there's three gods. There cannot be three gods. The Bible says one God. Therefore, Trinitarianism is wrong. And I'm like, that wasn't my position. You didn't win. You know, if you didn't argue and address my position, you're committing a straw man fallacy. That happens a lot in a recent debate, and this one is public, arguing eschatology stuff on Revelation 20. I made a very strong, I think, strong exegetical case and for a particular millennial position. And one of my opponents just responded back and he said, well, because you didn't talk about this issue, therefore your position is wrong and mine is right. And I'm just like, like you didn't touch at all my argument. And, you know, I mean, my response to that is my argument stands. If you have no response to it, I'm going to take that as you can't answer back. And this argument's over. I won if you're not going to engage it. One final fallacy from a different family of fallacies is known as a fallacy of presumption. Okay, fallacies of presumption are fallacies that assume what it is that they're trying to prove before the argument is even made. All right, a fallacy of presumption is a fallacy that assumes what it's trying to prove before the argument is even made. The most infamous, I guess, of fallacies belonging to this family of arguments is called begging the question or circular reasoning. Okay, we've talked about that one. Basically, it's just an argument that engages in circular reasoning would be like, the Bible is true because the Bible is true, and it just basically takes you around, and it never really, it just kind of spins its wheel. Okay, now we've dealt with circular reasoning and the different kinds of circular reasoning and the kind of valid form of circular reasoning actually in previous lessons, so I'm not going to detail it here, but the one that I do want to talk about is the false dichotomy. Okay, the false dichotomy. The false dichotomy fallacy occurs when you have a disjunctive premise, that is, you have an either-or, okay, an either-or statement, either red or black. Okay, that's a disjunctive premise. When you have either-or, okay, when that's presented and it presents two unlikely alternatives as if they were the only ones available, okay? And then the arguer eliminates the undesirable alternative, leaving the desirable one as a conclusion. Basically, when you're only given two options, then there's really more. Okay, that's what would be this false dichotomy. Okay, so as an example, for instance, consider the logical problem of evil. This problem usually states something about God, you know, being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, but yet evil exists. And so in a sense, the problem basically states if God exists, then evil cannot. So you see what it's doing. It's basically going either God or evil. You can't have both. It's basically what that problem is doing. Okay, and so, you know, and then they'll argue, well, since evil exists, it follows that God does not. That's basically how the logical problem of evil is constructed. Okay, but the false dichotomy presented here is that the premise assumes, without proving, that God and evil cannot coexist. The non-critical person might be prone, that is, you know, in a sense, I guess what Proverbs would call the simple-minded, you know, they might accept that premise. And if you accept the false dichotomy, you're basically left, well, if God exists, then evil can't, and so you have to deny evil. Okay, basically in a sense, become Buddhist in some sort of way, right? Or if I say evil exists, because I definitely see suffering, so this was David Hume, this is why he constructed the logical problem of evil. If I see evil, God cannot exist, was his conclusion. He couldn't see that God and evil can actually coexist. In a sense, the hidden premise, I guess, or the, you know, refuting the false dichotomy that Christians can point out there, is that God and evil can coexist. Your problem, right, we have to tell them, your problem is that you don't think that God can have a good reason for allowing evil to coexist with him. So in a sense, we have to challenge the atheist to essentially prove that God can have no reason to allow evil to exist. So, lots of fallacies. These aren't all of them by a long shot. Okay, in the book that I was using, I was referring to one of my old logic textbooks. I was only at page 150 out of like 700 on pointing out fallacies and stuff like that. So I mean, there's a lot that can go into this. Okay, but these are just some of the few common ones that I have a little bit more experience with, and that we should keep in mind. Okay, keep in mind also that that arguing as a Christian means not arguing in a manner that you yourself would not accept. So Christians shouldn't appeal to these, especially when emotions run high and whenever we don't have anything, when we don't know what to respond. This is where the temptation comes in. When you hear a philosophical critique, and you're not, maybe you're not very good at philosophy, or you're not very well versed in science stuff. Like when people come at me with DNA and genetics, I just like, I kind of like that. That's not my field of expertise. And the temptation there is kind of just, well, you're just dumb, man, and you're just not accepting what God says. And there's the fallacy. Now I'm not addressing their argument. I'm calling them names. I'm attacking their character, and now I'm arguing in a sense in a way that's unbecoming for a Christian. So the Christian has to strive for consistency in order to present the truth clearly and make a compelling argument. However, being logical is not the only means of making a compelling argument. If that was the case, we should all become like Mr. Spock right now. That's the solution. There's apologetics. Become like Spock, okay? There are other skills that must be developed, to which we will now consider, okay? So this is rhetoric, all right? The skill of, in a sense, of speaking or persuading, okay? So one neglected aspect of apologetics that is rarely, and I do mean rarely, of all the apologetic books that I've read so far, only one, Scott Oliphant's Covenantal Apologetics, he's been the only one who addresses the issue of rhetoric. Some of the other guys, Van Til, they appeal to it, a little bit. He's got that principle, be gentle in manner and powerful in substance. But I mean, that's it. He doesn't really go into any depth. Every other book is just pretty much, well, this is how you argue. This is what you can do. This is what you can say. And that's it. But a lot of people, a lot of Christians that I know, that want to do apologetics and they get into apologetics and they're doing apologetics on social media, they speak and they come across in such a way that they're really distasteful in a sense as Christians to unbelievers and even to other Christians. So we want to learn a little bit about rhetoric. Okay, rhetoric is just the art and skill of persuasion. Okay, just the art and skill of persuasion. Many Christians think that if we just have the right argument and the right answers, that those alone will convince any opponent. But persuasion involves much more than that. Basically, what we need to recognize, okay, is that the heart has its own reasons for why it chooses things that are sometimes just beyond reason. Okay? The heart has its own reasons. Now, Aristotle, I know we're getting this one right, but Aristotle, he developed what is called a trivium of persuasion. Okay? According to Aristotle, he says, of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first kind depends on the personal character, okay, what he called the ethos, okay, the personal character of the speaker. The second kind, on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, pathos, that is the appeal to emotion, okay, the pathos. And the third, on proof or apparent proof provided by the words of the speech itself, the logos, okay, basically the content and formulation of your argument. The first part of the study is basically already focused on aspect of logos, okay. The logos of persuasion, this is Scott Oliphant, he says the logos of persuasion focuses our attention on the actual arguments, including the content of those arguments that we aim to present to a given audience. Okay, that's the appeal to reason. That's the appeal to the mind or the reasoning faculties of the audience. Okay, we don't need to spend any more time on that because we pretty much have so far. So let's move on to ethos, okay, or ethos. Okay. The ethos is the ethical appeal of the speaker on the audience. Okay, it is the ethical appeal of the speaker on the audience. Now, in an ideal world, basically a well-reasoned, logically coherent argument should be enough to persuade anybody of a sound mind, okay, and they should be convinced, and the debate would be over. That would be the ideal thing, the ideal world. I give the perfect argument, you give the perfect response by believing me, and that's it. We've done our job. But however, it's not like that. Okay, people often don't hear the arguments because they cannot get past the person speaking. All right, that's the plain truth. In fact, I've been studying a bit more on preaching. And I've often heard that a lot of times people will not hear your sermons or the things that you say if they can't get past the way that you look. And most people who are new to, coming into a new church, before they actually listen to the preacher, they kind of have to evaluate his mannerisms, how he moves, how he talks, all that kind of stuff. And they're more focused on that than on the sermon. I thought that was interesting, but at the same time I was like, yeah, that's pretty true. That seems to be the way it is. Okay, now according to one scholar, he said rhetoricians were realistic enough to recognize that people are creatures of passion and of will as well as of intellect. Hence, we need to learn how to deal with people with where they are and not how we think that they should be. So, many attempts at Christian apologetics end in frustration over the opponent not being convinced by a sound argument. Okay, again, I've heard friends like, I gave the perfect argument, I don't understand it, it was airtight, he should have just bowed down and said, oh, I believe in the Christian God, but it didn't go that way, that aspect, in a sense, of apologetics can be frustrating, especially, if the person is depending completely on their argument to win over the person. Okay, but the truth of the matter is, is that people don't evaluate, merely the argument, but the one who's arguing as well. So ethos generally focuses on one's character. There's a place in the Bible, in Acts 17. We looked at that passage sometime. Okay, well, Paul, he's in Athens, and he's been reasoning with the Jews and in the marketplace, talking about Christ and the resurrection, etc., etc. And there's a place where before Paul gets allowed to speak, okay, when everybody wants to hear what he has to say, well, one of the persons says, I believe it's in Acts 17, 18, the audience calls him a babbler. Okay, now a babbler was basically somebody who was listening and he would listen to other teachers teach. He himself wasn't a teacher, but he would get up and just want to say things just to get an audience. People thought that Paul was a babbler, and in doing that, they attributed to him a character that didn't let them listen to him because they confused him. Like, oh, it's just a babbler. Don't listen to what he has to say. They did that. They challenged and they questioned his character. And so because of that, they dismissed his claims at one point. Modern preachers do this quite a bit too. In order to gain an audience and appear more appealing, pastors have modified, and this is not always bad, right? But pastors have modified the traditional dress of the frock that was traditionally worn in high liturgy preachers of the past. I mean, in most churches today, pastors don't wear that long robe. They dress pretty casual. Why? Because a lot of it, just for people nowadays, it's easier on the eyes. Put it that way. And just simply, a lot of times, just the way a person can dress, they can come across as just, yeah, he's like me. It's more appealing, and you can actually gain an audience. Of course, you have to be careful, because if you do that too much, you begin to basically become like what you were trying to win. So it's important, not to do that too much. But we need to recognize that there's a lot more factors involved than just quoting Bible or making arguments. It's difficult. There's something else to consider too, right? Because it's about the character. It's difficult for a Christian to convince anybody of the existence of a holy God who does not themselves lead a holy life. In this day and age, the world is extremely quick to call out hypocrisy. Extremely quick. Especially at Christians. Not so much in a sense, within certain political movements, but especially against Christians. I mean, there's that whole mess with the Duggars and several other Christian scandals. But I mean, the world is very quick to call out hypocrisy right away. An unhappy Christian is going to be far lesser appealing than a happy drunkard when it comes to talking about how to find true happiness in life. We have to consider too our own walks, our own time with the Lord, our own feelings about God. I mean, I read a book called Spiritual Depression. This was written back, I want to say in the 50s, in the mid-50s when the author wrote it, at least when he preached them. D. Martin Lloyd-Jones, he preaches in England. But, he made all these things. Like, if you're a sad or depressed Christian, you're not going to have a very good witness. People are going to be more drawn to people, the excitement and the entertainment that people display at football games. And of course, up there he meant like, soccer and rugby and things like that, Manchester United, etc. But if people display more excitement over that than they do over church or over their Christianity, there's the appeal that happens that way a lot more. A person excited about their worldly interests is going to be more convincing than a Christian who is not excited about going to the house of God or opening their Bible or knowing their own faith. I mean, it's really sad when when people know more about their favorite sports team or the stats on their fantasy football leagues than they do about the Bible. That kind of witness, that doing apologetics, and if that's what your life looks like, it's basically going to be, well, my Christianity is not as important. It doesn't make a difference in my life. And it basically, the underlying argument, to the person that you're doing apologetics with is, it's not going to make a difference in your life either. Listen to Peter's words and note what he says about the character of a Christian. This is from 1 Peter 3:14 through 17. He says, "But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, that is, when they attack your character, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." Basically, in a sense, what Peter is saying is, don't be the person who defeats your own apologetic. Don't be the person who defeats your own apologetic ministry. A good conscience comes from good character. A guilty conscience stems from a sinful life before God and others. So apologists must guard their own witness. Okay, apologists must guard their own witness. This goes for every Christian, because every Christian is called to be an apologist. So every Christian must guard their witness. Hence, like it or not, convincing someone of the truthfulness of Christianity involves more than an argument. It involves your whole life. It involves your whole life. In the context of 1 Peter, we can see that it involves your home life. Just before Peter talks about being persecuted, he talks about the relationship between husband and wife, children, and stuff like that. So in a sense, in the larger picture of what Peter is saying is that your witness it's everywhere. It's everything that you do. It's your whole life. It involves your home life. It involves your relationships. Where am I at here? It involves how you treat non-believers, and especially, so right there in verse 14, especially how you suffer. Especially how you suffer. As Christians, we're called to suffer well. No question about it. We are called to suffer well. The Bible tells us that suffering is going to come. You call yourself a disciple is not greater than the master. The master suffered. Guess what? You're going to suffer too. Just expect it. It's going to happen. Christians have foundations to suffer well. We have a foundation to suffer well because no matter what gets taken from us in this life, the resurrection is proof that we're going to get it back.
From the cross.
From the cross. Amen. Yeah. So Christians have a foundation. When Christians suffer and look as hopeless or as defeated as people without hope, again, it comes back to, look, if your Christianity doesn't make a difference in how it works out in your life, there's no way you're going to try to tell them, hey, believe in Jesus for salvation, when they're just going to look at you like, it's not looking like it's making a difference in your life. Why should it make a difference in mine? All right.
So let me ask you a question. What do you suggest for that? I mean, that might be a dumb question.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, we was always told by Mom that Christians, they suffer different. It is not as bad as a non-believer. Is that correct?
It shouldn't be, yeah.
So, therefore, if you have that hope and trust in God, you should look a little bit more positive even in those times.
In a sense, it doesn't have to be like so much like, okay, I just lost, somebody super close to me. I'm going to have a smile on my face. Yeah. I don't think it calls for that, but at the same time, in a sense, we grieve. The Bible says to grieve, right? But we don't grieve as people without hope.
Yes.
we grieve
Because we have
with
that
hope.
in us that
Yes.
we shouldn't. It should come
Yes.
outward, and it shouldn't be like that.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, people are looking. People are watching, that's for sure. So,
Yeah.
like you said, they're not going to say, well, it's not doing nothing for you, so why would I waste my time?
Yes.
All right?
So in a sense, like when we've talked about people who have idols, when people lose the thing in a sense that was their idol, in a sense for them, it feels like the world has stopped. Everything has come to a halt. They don't want to live anymore. They don't want to, in a sense, they naturally go into depression of some sort.
Yeah,
You
like
know,
my clients. I give them the 5 stages of the grieving process. So why are you doing this? Well, because you can't use alcohol and drugs like you used to, and now there's stipulations by the law, and so there's consequences after that. So a lot of them grieving, they didn't even know it. And then we broke that down and dissected it, and they said, yeah, okay. So then they understand what the point of view was.
Yeah. Versus a Christian, in a sense, let's say a Christian loses a loved one, a Christian can know, either if they were saved, even if they were not, they can know that, God's greater glory is served. And since the world doesn't end when we suffer, because we recognize, that someone suffered, for us ultimately, and even suffers with us. And since Christ grieves with us still, in that sort of way. So Christian suffering should be different. It should definitely be
Because
different.
of what we've been taught. Am I right about it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the third part of persuasion, is what is called pathos, or pathos, which is the appeal to emotion. We're going to be careful with this one. Now, many people do not like to admit that emotions play a part in making choices. We don't like to say that we're driven by our emotions or that we're driven by our passions and things like that. We all like to think of ourselves as rational and dignified creatures who are above and beyond the base animalistic, responses from emotion. However, anybody who's ever seen a person, especially a man in love, knows that sometimes you do stupid things without thinking at all. All right? We can all go back to the days, when we've done stupid things because our emotions just get hold of us. We can't explain them, For me, it was showing off. There was a girl that I liked. I'm outside in PE running. I'm going to show everybody how fast I am. And boom, run into a pile of water. Didn't even know it was there and slipped and fell right on my back. Forgot to bring my extra shirt too, so that didn't go well. That one didn't go well the rest of the day. But yeah, that's what happens. That's what you get.
Hey, not poor thing, pole thing.
Okay. But clearly, we need to say it. Clearly, our emotions play a part in our choice. Even anybody ever tried to go on a diet? Notice how I said it, right? Try to go on a diet. Why? We can reason in our minds and we can make the arguments why I should go on a diet because I'll be healthier, I'll look better, etc. But that smell of pizza just comes across you and you lose it. And it's like, I don't need that diet. All of a sudden, there went reason, there went the rational argument, and that's just pure passion at that point.
Talking about that.
There's pure passion, just making the decisions that way. Listen to Scott Oliphant explain this. He says this: whenever we speak of pathos, or pathos, of persuasion, though the word itself has reference roughly to one's emotional state, we are thinking much more broadly than just how those to whom we speak might feel. When we think of pathos, we are interested in a proper and personal understanding of those to whom we speak. In persuasion, it's the task of the speaker properly to construe his audience with a view toward communication that is adequate to the occasion. Basically, know your audience. Put it that way. The way that you might talk, let's say, to a young teenager or to an older adult or to an angry atheist or to a sad and depressed person, you can't talk the same way to each one of those people. No. You have to know your audience. In a sense, you have to be able to understand their emotions, their feelings, so that you know how to respond properly. For instance, there's some preachers that I just cannot stand. I can read them, Okay, here's one of them, right, for me, John Piper. Believe it or not, I love to read John Piper, but I can't stand to hear him preach. I just can't, because he's just always very loud, and his hands are like, all over the place. And I can't stand him preach, and not because he says false things or anything like that. He's a pretty sound pastor, but I just, the way that he communicates doesn't appeal to me.
And some people would say, well, you need to overlook all of that and worry about the content and what's being said. And if it's legitimate and it's sound, okay, then, I'm not saying that's not me, but some people would say that to you.
Yeah.
If you was open about it.
There's part of it, in a sense, it depends the purpose of why you're listening. In one sense, okay, if you're saying, I just, everything that guy says is false, well, why? Well, because he flails his arms when he preaches.
Not bad.
Well, that doesn't follow.
Yeah, not bad.
That doesn't follow, but, some people, at least, this is what people have recognized, is that if, some people just cut across the grain the wrong way. We have different personalities, we have different, what are the words I'm looking for? Temperaments. We have different temperaments in that sort of way, and some people just don't appeal to certain temperaments. They just don't go with it. Me, I like listening to Tim Keller a lot, and not just because he's Tim Keller or anything like that, but he's just more conversational in a sense in his approach, and that just appeals to me. I can't listen to preachers, for the most part, who are always shouting and who are always angry. I also cannot listen to preachers who are always crying, or who will always tend to start crying at some point in a sermon, because at some point I'm just, oh man, please, and for me, because I kind of recognize that as a manipulative approach to emotional appeal.
Not always the case, because they could be sincere. And then, you know what? I'm going to say this like Mother would say, keep on living. Because you going to stand, and them tears may come out. I may get to see it, I may not. I may not be around, but you better watch what you say.
No, okay, see, no, see, and this is where I have to be clear, because in a sense, there's a right time to cry.
True.
There's a right time to cry, but if every sermon, if you I don't know, in every sermon or in every speech, it doesn't have to be with tears. Some sermons, in a sense, some speeches should sometimes require more force and more thunder behind them, possibly.
So you're saying it's staged then? Because some people say
no.
coming up that they could not help it. It's just, they look at how far God has brought them out of the dump today, and they get emotional about it too. So you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I'm not saying it's staged. All I'm saying is that their rhetoric it doesn't appeal to everybody the same way. In a sense, their method of approach, it's not always going to catch.
So you're still saying it's staged, kind of, sort of, right?
No. I'm not saying it's staged. Some people do. There are some people who do stage things like that, but no, not everybody. I'm not saying that.
Yeah, okay.
But it's just for me. I guess because I'm my temperament. I'm very. For the most part, I do use my emotions here and there. Believe it or not, right? But for the most part, I'm very cold logic. I'm kind of very like, there's a problem, let's get it solved. Versus sometimes there's a problem, I want to sit here and cry and think about it and mope over it for a bit, and I'm just like. And
that's weepy to you.
Yeah, and I'm kind of just like, for me, my thinking is just kind of like, problem, let's solve it.
You need to be firm. And move forward. Yeah.
So it just, the temperament is different in a sense. So kind of what I'm saying more here is that be aware of in a sense, possibly the temperament or the emotions or the attitude of your audience, and tailor your message accordingly. How you approach accordingly. So for instance, let's say some people, let's say that you're talking to an angry atheist, and he's angry. He doesn't want to believe in God because he believes that God is just a God of wrath and that God is angry. So if you're doing evangelism and you come to that angry atheist and you're like, God is mad at you, God is going to punish you, and you do that sort of thing.
The delivering approach is just,
you lost them.
Yeah.
However, that approach would be more appropriate in a religious setting where the people have become comfortable in their religion. Hence you have like Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Who did he preach that to? He didn't preach that to rank unbelievers. He preached that to the church.
Yeah.
And he woke them up, in a sense, out of their religious slumber.
More accepted.
Yes.
Yeah.
So here's the thing too, like John Piper, it's been said that where he preaches, that's the context where he preaches. So that preaching resonates for the people in his area. But you've got somebody like Tim Keller in New York, who, they're not as religious, like in the Midwest or, things like that. You've got more atheist, agnostic, and a plurality of other religions. The approach is a bit different. It's contextualized, I guess, if you want to put it that way. So that's basically what it means, in a sense, using pathos, okay, or pathos, okay. I don't want to say pathos. I don't know why. Pathos sounds a little bit more Greek, okay.
Yeah.
But saying it, or approaching that way, that you have to take that into account when you consider the broad, in a sense, the broad category of persuasion, okay, and argument. All right.
This is the last session for apologetics, and so in lesson 16, it's coming out that I never knew you to be so critical. And I'm not saying nothing's wrong with it, but I just never, I'm glad that I got out and came in when I did.
Yeah. It's one of those things. I'm very like, my mindset on a lot of things is I'm very kind of like duty oriented.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of just like, let's do what you got to do to get it done. So I work that way, I guess, and I think that way, and like when I took logic, I loved it so much, I guess, because of that, and math even would go well with me too, because it's just very cold. It's just, you follow the steps basically, get the problem solved, and you do it that way. So I loved logic. That's the part that you miss, but I was the person for that, and I grid everything that I hear through that logic filter. Everything that I hear goes.
It stuck to you like that.
It stuck to me like that, yeah. So I'm always evaluating, always listening, and sometimes I'm watching, I'll watch TV with my wife, and I'll be like, what they're really doing, right? And I'll just ruin something like that.
Well, you call it evaluating. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
You call it being critical. You call it what you want to call it.
Oh man. So, we need to remember too, with all these tools, in a sense, with logic and in a sense, logos and ethos and pathos, we need to remember, one, keep in mind that even with arguments, the heart always has its own reason for choosing. I mean, sometimes, it's not your arguments that in a sense that a person might be convinced of Christianity. It's your life.
And so you said the heart, right? See, that's a mouthful right there, right? I think
because,
that's big.
Yeah, because in a sense, when you're arguing, in a sense, with another person, you're not just arguing against their mind. You're trying to convince their whole person.
So you put your heart into it and everything you have.
Yeah. So in a sense, you can't give away what you yourself don't have.
Yeah. So you got to go to the judge. Am I right about it?
Yeah.
And that's you, BD. You know what BD is over there, Esther? Bulldog. That's what it sounds like tonight. That's good though. I like it.
Oh well. So these are all the tools that we have, But never forget too, even though you have these tools, and if you're looking to do apologetics seriously and evangelism, you have to hone these skills. You have to hone these skills, and even like they told me in logic, don't stop practicing it. Always be critically, be thinking critically. Don't watch too much TV. If you do, watch it critically. Because the thing about amusement,
so you don't lose your focus, your sight.
You keep.
But you listen in that class.
Keep that knife sharp. That's what they tell me. You just keep that knife sharp. I mean, it's like training. If you stop doing it, you lose it, right?
I'll go with that.
But just remember too, in a sense, all these skills and when you hone them and when you put them together, it's kind of like you're building an altar. Okay? And you're praying that God will send down the fire once you've built it. Now, you might not get fire every time, right? But it's still your job to build the altar.
Well, do you panic when you don't get fire all the time?
No. Yeah, and we shouldn't, because we have to remember that God is sovereign. Yeah. God is sovereign. And so, listen to Paul. This is from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. He says, and when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony, or no, and when I came to you, brothers, did I mistype that or something? Anyway, did not come to you proclaiming the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. Now, he's basically saying that he did not come to them as a rhetorician. I didn't come to you because I was a skilled speaker. Apparently, Paul was bold in letter and was probably a stutterer, okay, or something of that manner in person. But he goes on, he says, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified.
So he set that aside, that was it.
So you have your tools. I mean, and this doesn't mean don't use logic, don't use these things, but you got to remember that your weapon is not those. Your weapon is the gospel. Ultimately, it is the gospel.
So, I guess you have a little room for logic and philosophy and stuff like that, but like you said, you can't lose folks to the fact.
Well, in a sense, put it this way. You want the logic, the reason, and the rhetoric to be the tool that carries the gospel, not what gets in the way of the gospel. Because some people, put it this way, some people are in apologetics and they do evangelism and they're pastors and they're all types of stuff in Christian ministry because they love to hear themselves talk. And they don't talk about the gospel, okay? They don't talk about the gospel. They just love to hear themselves. They love to hear the ideas that they share and things like that. And so that's an example, in a sense, of lofty speech and human wisdom actually getting in the way of the gospel. Yeah. In a sense, what Paul had in mind here were the Greeks, or what they call the sophists. That's where we get our English word sophistry from, sophisticated. Because there are these people that they could make these lofty arguments and, sound really great and eloquent and all types of stuff. But what did they actually say?
Yeah, the judgment is clouded too.
Yeah, well, a lot of times they were paid rhetoricians. So you could actually pay the guy, hey, I want you to argue this for me today. And then pay him the next day and go, now I want you to argue the other way. They had no claim. All they wanted was basically to speak and to show their eloquence. And what Paul is saying is, in a sense, those are good, but don't let those get in the way of the gospel. Let those be in service of the gospel. Make sure that the gospel message comes out clear. So Paul goes on, he says, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. So in a sense there's like the ethos. His life, his ministry demonstrated the Spirit. It demonstrated the gospel. Then he goes on to say, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of man, right? Because some people are Christians because their favorite preacher is a Christian. When their favorite preacher suddenly falls, they stop being Christian with him. Because why? Their faith was not in God. It was in that person's ministry. And that's what Paul's saying, that's not what I want. I want your life, I want your faith built on the gospel. And to put it another way here too, don't build your faith on your parents' faith or on your grandpa's faith. Make sure your faith is your own and that your own faith is built on the gospel. So, final concluding remarks here. I wanted to share some passages of Scripture that admonish how to speak to unbelievers. I'm not even going to give any commentary, okay? I just want to share these passages of Scripture that tell us basically what I've been saying here today, I hope is conveyed through these Scriptures. So the first one is 1 Peter 3:15. We've looked at this one before. I've quoted in here, but let's look at it.
3:15.
1 Peter 3:15. This has been the foundation of this whole course, okay? Peter says this, but in your hearts, honor Christ as Lord. Always be prepared. There's the logos, right? The logic part, in a sense, the reason. Always have reason. Be able to give reason to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect.
And that's what we've been taught ever since kids. Don't be arrogant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because some people can be arrogant, but you know what? That didn't come from younger people. That came from older people that I saw coming up, that they were being arrogant. And to make their point, it just came out.
And today it's reversed. Today the arrogance is in the younger generations. It's in these younger evangelical movements that have been coming up, that there's a lot of the arrogance and the critique, in a sense, basically of old church or religion, is basically where that comes up with. So pendulum just kind of swing the other way.
Yeah.
You know. Another one, this is from Colossians chapter 4. Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6. Paul says this as he's ending his letter to the Colossians. He says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. So there's all logos, ethos, pathos, all combined. How are you to answer? With what are you going to answer? How are you going to answer? Make sure you're walking in wisdom. There's the ethos. That way your character, that way your witness lines up with the message that you're preaching.
You have to be in check.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A couple from Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 15. Proverbs 15, 1 and 2. Says, a soft answer turns away wrath.
Yes.
But a harsh word stirs up anger.
And that's the problem this day.
Yeah.
It's been for years. So.
And it prevents dialogue.
Yeah.
It prevents dialogue. The minute you have you have two sides that are at odds with each other, and you need to come together. If the first words are angry, dialogue's over. That's pretty much it. And then verse 2, it says, the tongue of the wise commands knowledge. Proverbs 15, 1 and 2.
Yeah, you know what? I just read that last night. Proverbs. That's my favorite. But every time I go back through it, I get different focus.
Yeah. So, hopefully this helps a bit.
Yeah.
The tongue of the wise commands knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly.
Yes.
Bad arguments, guess what you just became? You just became a fool.
Yeah.
If you're using bad argumentation. Okay? Proverbs 15. I believe that should be 20. What do I have? Oh, no, 26. Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5. These are the last verses. Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Sometimes your best apologetic is to shut up.
When you say folly, you're talking about foolish talk, right?
Foolish, yes. Yeah, and it's becoming a fool, acting foolishly. And the fool in Proverbs, is, it's not a good person to be, okay? It's not the person you want to be. All right, so answer not a fool according to his folly. And we've applied that in different ways, too, is that you don't answer a person in apologetics based on their own presuppositions. You start from Christian presuppositions. Okay, that's another way that we've applied this verse here before. Okay, verse 5. Answer a fool according to his folly. So sometimes in apologetics, this is where sometimes they answer back. Okay, and of course be careful how you do it, right? But the answer back is to show the person the foolishness of their own position. This is what Paul did in Acts 17.
So it's just the same as saying politely put them in their place. Is that correct?
And in a sense, lead them to the idea here is more lead them to the conclusion that they don't want to see.
Yeah.
Using their own premise. So in a sense, like Paul in Acts 17, when he confronts, he says, I see that you all are very religious. Your city's full of idols, and you have a statue that says to the unknown God, right? So you have these statues. He looks at them and says, you've got statues, and they're made of silver and gold and all types of metals, okay? But, he says, but you guys say, your own poets say that we are all God's offspring. And they also say that he's not far from us, and that we're all made in his likeness or in his image. But if that's true, how come we're not made out of gold and silver? And basically Paul, he basically showed, he answered them according to their own folly.
And beat them up with it.
And he beat them up with it. So that's one approach there. So here it is. It says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. So in apologetic situations, in a sense, part of it is offering correction, defense of Christianity. Part of logic is when a person offers a scarecrow, or a straw man fallacy, is that you call it out and you tell them that's not Christianity. A lot of times when people argue against Christianity, when they argue against the Christian faith, they're really not arguing against the Christian faith. They're arguing against the television version of Christianity.
What they see a lot
They're,
of times.
yes, they argue against what they've seen, what they've heard, but never really, in a sense, what they've studied or looked at, or that sort of way, So,
Oh, you had this.
yeah.